I literally just got back from the theaters. I saw Homestead in theaters on the opening weekend. Now, I will preface this by saying a lot of people have been complaining about Homestead, the movie, being basically an intro or pilot episode for the Homestead series. A lot of people were complaining about that. A lot of people were upset. I will say, as someone who went online, did some digging, finding updates and details about the movie ever since the initial trailer came out from Angel Studios, that was not a surprise to me. It was not something that they were trying to hide. It was not something that Angel Studios was trying to hide, that there was going to be a series that was going to be part of the Homestead franchise. Now, they didn't put it in the trailer, but when they were putting out promotional materials, making posts on their Instagram account, they were very clear and upfront saying, hey, this is going to be a movie. There's going to be a series that takes place after that. The only thing they weren't clear about is when that series would be released. So I was actually very surprised to, be looking at the Angel Studios app like 2 days ago and seeing 2 episodes available of the season. I was like, oh, because I assumed that they would take some time to shoot the series and then put that out sometime in the spring for the spring television season. But no, it seems like they shot the movie and the show back to back. So full disclosure, I went into this movie with that additional context. So I was not surprised when they when they gave it an open-ended ending. Now, I will say I somewhat did expect them to do a little bit of a better job of telling a contained story inside of that one movie, because generally that's what you'll get, especially with TV movies. You'll have, your story will be told, but there will be more things that will be left behind for the next series to pick up. A good example of this is 24 Redemption. Does a really good job of telling a contained story, but there's more stuff going on with Jack Bauer that needs to be followed up in the continuing season, and that's what they decide to do. I was expecting more of a similar thing here, but it's more like 2 episodes back to back, more than one self-contained story in a TV movie. It sort of felt like the movie could have ended maybe 30 minutes earlier, and the ending would have felt a little bit more complete. I think it's like a shame that they did not do that. But I will say, I enjoyed the movie. I think it was very fun. They did a great job with all of the tension. There are things that, if you've ever seen Civil War, this movie is very much like Civil War light. Like, if you could imagine, these movies could potentially even be happening simultaneously, because these people are out here in the Rockies. They're a little bit isolated. Like, yes, we got, people going at each other's throats, fighting and scrambling over materials and supplies. But at the end of the day, like, when something catastrophic happens in a big country like that, different things are going to be happening in different parts of the country. And I think this movie did a good job of kind of showcasing that as well. I think it's the biggest parts for me, at least the best parts for me, were the intro, like the beginning, and then like the middle part, because the way that the bomb went off, to me, was not entirely plausible, at least from the perspective of causing a lot of like casualties. I think there was a way that they could have done the initial explosion that would have been a little bit more believable, especially when it comes to the scale of the harm that it causes. It's also a little bit vague about some other details, like a bomb goes off in one place and then a power grid goes down somewhere else, and there's kind of like a talk of like, oh, maybe somebody hacked it, but that part is not necessarily clear. Now, to be fair, they didn't need to spell this all out, and it doesn't really matter how that stuff happens. But to me, I guess, as someone who's watched media from shows where they're very meticulous about spelling out how things happen, I think like 24 is an example of this, even though some of the ways they explain things are not necessarily technically possible. But Mr. Robot, especially how they describe the way that things are taking place in catastrophic events, I was sort of let down by the lack of specifics as far as how in the world we exactly got to this point. But once we were at this point, there was some stuff in this movie that I think echoed in a complementary way a couple other movies that came out this year, which were Leave the World Behind and Alex Garland's Civil War, very much in a way that they could sort of form as a I guess, an informal trilogy. We've got Leave the World Behind first, and then Civil War, and then we've got Homestead. I think actually this movie mirrors Alex Garland's Civil War in some very interesting ways. For example, I think embracing the aspect of different groups fighting for power in the aftermath of such an event. So like, for example, we've got like forces moving across certain states, kind of both establishing authority, right, and taking over power and control, but also giving out supplies and things. So the idea that this movie is sort of pitching, that these groups that are kind of sweeping into these areas, it's not pitching an idea of these groups being entirely nefarious, right? They're just establishing their dominance or whatever, but at the same time, of course, you've got groups who they just want to do what they want to do. They want to be autonomous. They don't want these people who are not the established government telling them what to do. I kind of also like that as well. One thing also about this movie is it's a Christian movie that is not overly preachy about its Christian message. Now, I will say a couple trailers came out. So there was one trailer at the end of the movie for the series, and then I think there's sort of like a mid-season trailer of sorts that basically just dropped on YouTube today. The dialogue in both of those trailers do make it seem like it's going to start being a little bit preachy, not necessarily about God being real or whatever, but the importance of having someone or something to believe in during trying times, which I think is a really good pitch that you can make. Actually, I just finished watching Fanny and Alexander, which, even though the person who made that movie comes off, at least in that movie, as someone who hates God, he actually has a very similar message. I guess he leans more towards the occult as being the thing to believe in. But the idea that you need something or someone to believe in during trying times, I think is a general enough pitch that enough audience members will be able to latch onto and support, that this movie is not going to drive people away. So some aspects of this movie may come off as a little cheesy to some folks, but it's not going to be because of the speaking about God or Jesus in this movie that people are not going to like this movie. I think if people are not going to like this movie, they might not like it because of the teen romance, which is pretty bad, in my opinion. Now, I will say that when it comes to post-apocalyptic media like this, or media where like how America functions or the world functions and runs is completely transformed, the romance is generally pretty bad. Like, I remember watching Terra Nova as well as Falling Skies, and the teen romance in both of those is not atrocious, but it's getting there. It's getting there. So, to say that this movie has terrible teen romance doesn't necessarily mark it as being any particularly worse than any standard Hollywood production. If you were going to go out and watch something secular, you weren't going to get better teen romance than this. So I don't really, mark this as something against Homestead. This just seems to be a thing where you can't make a post-apocalyptic film and have good teen romance. It just doesn't work. And considering how minor of a plot point that is, I actually don't mind it at all either. Now, I will say the one scene where it sort of takes the focus, I think is kind of long and it feels very drawn out. One thing that makes the teen romance not ruin those other works of art that I mentioned, like Falling Skies, is that those scenes are pretty short. But because Homestead is a theatrical release, they're not constrained by the 40 minutes that a typical episode of television would limit you to. So in a 2-hour-long movie, they can spend 10-15 minutes on a teen romance that's crappy, when, let's say, TNT would choose to only devote maybe 3 to 5 minutes on that same story. So it feels a little bit worse than it does just because of how long and drawn out the scene is. But again, it's no worse than anything you would see on post-apocalyptic TV show or post-apocalyptic film. Now, again, the action in this movie, I think it definitely works. And I will say the movie does a better job of building up the tension than delivering on the action. Not to say that the action is bad. There is one sequence where there's a lot of gunfire and it should be like a high octane scenario, and you would expect to see some like wider shots of people getting hit and stuff and people firing and shooting and stuff. But they instead choose to do some tighter camera angle shots, and I think they strategically film things in a way where it's not as violent as it could be. I think part of that is considerations for the audience. This is an Angel Studios film. A lot of these viewers are going to be Christians. They're probably not going to want to see something that's overly bloody or violent. But at the same time, for seeing that short, you can't really afford to pull punches. I say, give me more blood, give me more people getting hit by bullets, show some more impacts, kind of show the brutality of the scenario, because I think it relays the gravity of the situation. Because yes, even in the one scene I'm thinking of, there is a at the aftermath, it's like, okay, this is serious. People's lives are at stake. We can't keep on throwing ourselves into these scenarios. But at the same time, I feel like there should be more of a feel of danger in those scenarios than there is. Now, I will say still, it's not terribly bad. Much of the movie is about, certain people getting into the homestead and kind of like figuring out the rules of the road, right? You've got the guy who runs the homestead, Ross, who he sort of is very indecisive and, in my opinion, somewhat weak, because he's not sure exactly what he wants to do. He wants to be very merciful and gracious to the people outside the gate who want to get in and feed their families. But on the other side, he's looking at his materials, his produce, his resources, and he's like, we do not have what it takes to feed everyone who wants to get into the homestead. So he is very, very conflicted there. And that leads to him kind of being indecisive or making poor decisions, or allowing his wife to make decisions for him, when I feel like he should be the one taking charge, because it's he's the one who invited these people to come over, like the security guards. I found it interesting that even the security guards who, despite the fact that they're very much like, we need to secure perimeter, we need to shoot intruders, he was being very patient and gracious with the guy who's running the homestead, both in a respectful way of being like, okay, well, this guy owns the homestead, not me, so ultimately he's the one in charge, but also from this perspective of, maybe I'm not the right guy to lead this place, so I shouldn't be taking things over. And, being like, oh, I'll let this guy figure things out. And seeing the interplay that some of the characters have, because some of the characters are believers and some of the characters are unbelievers, but seeing the interplay of these characters fighting through moral dilemmas that have no clear answer was very fascinating to see on television, especially when Angel Studios put in a fair bit of nuance into this film. The way that people were talking, the people involved in the production, they were saying that Neil McDonough's character is some sort of villain. Now, that may prove itself to be true in the series, but I think despite the music in the series, the script itself is very neutral. I think that this is a situation where there's no right or wrong answer. Like if someone is coming up to your gate and claiming to be from the government, what do? Do you do what he says and just believe everything that he has to say, or do you say leave, and if you don't leave, I'm going to shoot you down? What do you do? Or what do you do if you have 5 hungry families at your gate and you don't think that you have the food to feed them sustainably for several months? What do? Do you leave them out there to starve, or do you invite them in? Moral dilemma. I personally don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to those questions, and I appreciate the story for having the nuance to be like, you know what? This person might be right or this person might be wrong, even if I disagree with the viewpoint of the people who made the movie. So all in all, I think this movie is fine. I on Letterboxd, I gave it a 3.5 stars. A lot of people were mad about the fact that this led into a series. I already knew that it was going to lead into a series, so I thought that was fine. But I mean, is it better than the other 2 post-apocalyptic films that I saw this year? Leave the World Behind and Alex Garland's Civil War? I would say no, but I will give credit to Angel Studios, because I think it's not that far behind Leave the World Behind. I think even though the scenarios in all 3 of those movies were pretty plausible, I think Leave the World Behind's scenario was slightly less plausible than the other 2 movies. I think that Homestead was almost as plausible as Alex Garland's Civil War. So because of that, I have to give it marks for that. Very clearly, the people who made this movie kind of were looking at the landscape and being like, oh, I could see how in this certain isolated area, things could turn out this way in a disaster scenario. So all around, I think a fair movie, not a crazy great movie, not an excellent movie, but it's good. I think it's more than serviceable. It should be enjoyable for a lot of people in the audience. Now, some people might not like it. I think that the dialogue for one of the characters is extremely cheesy, but hey, get enough Christians around in a group and you're going to have someone who talks like that. So, it makes the world feel lived in. It makes the world feel believable. I think. No knock on Christians, by the way, but we just have our own Christianese in the way that we speak that, a lot of people in the secular world don't really speak that way. So it's going to throw a lot of non-Christian viewers off when they go watch this movie and be like, why is this person speaking like she's a Lord of the Rings character? Like, I think if you're a Christian watching this movie, because of that, you're not going to have as difficult of a time watching this movie as if you were an unbeliever who's not familiar with the way that Christians put things sometimes. But still, in general, I think the movie's fine. I wish it ended a little bit earlier, just that it had a more... its ending felt a little bit more final, but still fine movie. I recommend it if you don't have any other movies to watch or you've been hankering for some post-apocalyptic fun in your theater going experience. By the way, if you've seen this movie, let me know in the comment section what you guys thought of it. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts. I think a lot of the reception online is skewed. A lot of people are giving it like 1 out of 5s or half stars out of 5s, specifically because they're disappointed but by the fact that there's a series coming out. But regardless of that, what do you guys think of the movie? I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts. Always looking to consume more Christian entertainment and support more Christian media. This is just one film along that journey. So, glad to put out this review. Very interested to hear your thoughts.